Hello and welcome to another video review. This is HeXen Beyond Heretic for DOS, Macintosh, PlayStation, Saturn, and Nintendo 64. This review is coming to you courtesy of Gray Sunrise. He sent me this, so thank you. It is greatly appreciated. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to Heretic. It was developed by Raven Software and released in 1995 for DOS and later for other systems as well. It's also much lesser known than Heretic. You ask people if they know about Heretic, and most people who know anything about 90s FPSs are going to know Heretic because it was pretty much ubiquitous with Doom. They were constantly available in just about every shareware collection you could find, widely circulated, that sort of thing. HeXen, not so much. And I'm not entirely sure why. I just don't think it was marketed as strongly as the other games were. Doom was a worldwide sensation, of course, but Heretic wasn't so much of a sensation as it was just a really popular game. HeXen comes along and it does things differently. It's still using the Doom engine, but you don't really hear so much about HeXen. And I know I honestly didn't even hear about it until much later, as in the early 2000s. And it wasn't really until recently that I managed to actually play this thing in any real capacity. So the question is, why would it be lesser known than Heretic, or why would it be less popular? And does it do anything differently from Heretic? Does it improve on things, or what goes on with this thing? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's not really a big step up or a step back for Heretic. It's really pretty much the same, except for some slight differences here and there. It's more modified in terms of the Doom engine than Heretic was, and they implemented a jump button, so there's more verticality to the game. You can have jumping puzzles, which suck, or you can have things like just more height to your levels, which is certainly much more impressive than something like Heretic, where it was fairly straightforward Doom clone style stuff. They also decided that they were going to keep the dark fantasy art style, and it works pretty well for the game. I mean, the environments especially look certainly dark fantasy. There's not a huge amount of color in this game, but where it is, it's rather vibrant and looks very nice. Mostly you're looking at a lot of browns and grays, though. Again, it's understandable because they went for that dark fantasy art style, and they do manage to make up for it by actually having a fair amount of color, even though there is a lot of brown and gray. But it makes everything feel a bit bland sometimes. Heretic tended to have quite a few vibrant colors going for it, and this one just kind of doesn't. Not to mention that there's a distinct lack of enemy variety in this game. You're going to be fighting against the same handful of enemies throughout the entire game, and that's quite a few levels, I might add. And more if you decide to go through it as one of the other two characters, for example. And their designs, while cool, get rather tiring after a while, considering that you're just not really finding all that much new. It's stuff that you've kind of seen before, except for a couple here and there. And when you actually get into the meat of the game, it just gets very tiring very quickly to just see the same exact enemies throughout the entire game. It's not to say they're bad, it's just that the lack of variety makes it rather tiring by the end game. And then there's the sound design, which is pretty solid. The sound effects themselves are all fitting, they work rather well. The weapon sounds, the spell sounds are all certainly very beefy and powerful. When you launch your spells, for example, it just sounds cool. That said, the effect in-game isn't quite as cool, so you're just kind of sitting there going, well, this isn't all that impressive. Even though the sound effects are rather good, the effect in-game just doesn't really match them all that much. So it's a bit of a letdown. But then there's the music, which is surprisingly forgettable and unimpressive. It fits the game just fine. I mean, it's certainly that sort of thing that you would expect after having played Heretic, but it's just not all that impressive, and it doesn't really stick with you, even though it is certainly fitting to the game. So you're certainly not going to be bothered by it in-game, but it's not something that you're going to want to listen to, like, say, Doom's E1M1. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is extremely minimal, so it's not really what you're going to rely on. You play as one of three heroes, the fighter, the mage, or the cleric, and your entire objective is to take down the Serpent Rider Korax. That's really it. There's not much story to this game at all, and so it really does fall to the gameplay to bring it up. So how is the gameplay? Well, people who've played Heretic will notice that it's similar in a lot of ways, but at the same time it's not, which is kind of what makes it interesting. You still go around the levels, you still kill a bunch of enemies, pick up items, have a variety of weapons available, that sort of thing. And many of the items that you found in Heretic return, like the Tome of Power. But they'll have different functions this time around. And depending on which character you're playing, different items will actually have different functions. For example, the flechettes have a function for one character of just being thrown on the ground and they roll a bit and then explode. Whereas if you're using another character, you fling them and they explode in contact. And so different characters have different play styles. And that's what really makes this thing very different from Heretic. In Heretic, it was basically a Doom clone. You had weapons that were very, very equivalent to what you had in Doom. You had your basic shotgun style crossbow in this thing. You had a rapid fire weapon, the Dragon Claw, all sorts of things like that. In this, not so much. Each player has a different weapon set. The fighter, for example, starts off with just gauntleted fists. And these do quite a bit of damage. In fact, they do the most damage of all of the starting weapons for every character. And eventually you'll get access to a magic axe, which just does a bit more damage. And then you'll get access to a hammer that actually has projectile properties. And you'll also finally get the sword, which sends out energy in an arc. So the weapons themselves are more varied than what you had in Heretic. That said, each character only gets 4 of them. And so there's not a huge amount of variety within those characters. And you find yourself relying on 1 or 2 of the weapons, even though they tried to make it so each of them would have their uses. For example, again, with the fighter, the hammer is really their long-range weapon of choice, because pretty much all of their weapons are close range. In fact, the hammer is really the only thing that can reach out and touch someone at a distance. Meanwhile, if you're playing as the mage, all of their weapons are ranged. They have a wand to start with, I believe it's actually a staff, that shoots out a very, very weak projectile, but it's a projectile weapon. And then, of course, they get access to an ice spell, which actually will freeze enemies, and then you can shatter them. And you get access to a lightning spell. And then finally, you get access to a very, very powerful staff that launches exploding projectiles. Then there's the cleric. Cleric starts with a mace. Next thing they get is a serpent staff that shoots projectiles, and if you're at close range, actually will turn into basically a spear. The next weapon they get is a flame spell. And then they finally get access to a staff that launches a projectile, and when that projectile hits something, it spawns a series of spirits that will go around and seek out and attack enemies, which is incredibly satisfying to use, I have to say. Each of these weapons, except for your primary weapon, uses mana. The first weapon you'll ever pick up uses blue mana, the second weapon uses only green mana, and the ultimate weapon you get, which you actually have to find parts for, you basically collect a couple of parts and then you get access to that weapon, uses combined mana, so it'll use both blue and green, and it uses a lot of mana. So you have to be very careful with what weapons you're using at any given point. Each one will have a different application. For example, the ice spell is really handy in close quarters because it fans out, whereas the serpent staff for the cleric is good at pretty much every range because it's just a basic projectile weapon. But you also have to keep in mind the enemies. Some of the enemies have abilities that make them different from what you would find in something like Heretic. In Heretic, it was pretty straightforward what you were fighting. A lot of it was basically just based on Doom enemies. This one, not so much. You do have some basic melee enemies that will come after you. You do have flying imps like you did in Heretic. But they introduced a couple of other different types of enemies, one of which has a shield. It's a centaur with a shield. And whenever they have their shield up, they're actually immune to damage. So it makes it pretty interesting when you're actually playing the game, and you have to vary up your tactics depending on what you're fighting. That said, there's only a handful of enemy types in this game, and so it loses variety very, very quickly. You will find that you just use the same exact tactics throughout the entire game because it introduces these enemies fairly early on, and you don't really need to vary your tactics all that much to deal with them. And of course, with there being so few weapons available, that also helps lose variety. But that's what playing the different characters is for. After all, it's not just their weapon set. The fighter is the toughest and the fastest of all of the characters. He has the most health, he has the most armor, and he's really fast. The mage, on the other hand, is very frail. Least health, least armor, and the slowest. The cleric is basically a balance of the two. And so this adds some variety to the game, but at the same time, it can be kind of frustrating if you didn't know that going into it. And so what's really advisable for someone who's going into this first time is probably to play as the cleric, because they're the most balanced. They have a variety of attacks that are both good at close range and long range, whereas the mage is almost entirely long range and the fighter is almost entirely close range. Not to say you can't do well as either of those, but they take a bit more practice to get good with. But then there's the one thing that really sets this apart from Heretic, other than just being a wildly different game in terms of characters and playstyles, and that is the level design. In Heretic, your level design was basically what you would find in something like Doom, where it was fairly straightforward. You went from one end of the level to the other, you maybe had to pick up a couple of keys, that sort of thing. In HeXen, on the other hand, every level is centered around a hub, and so you actually have to go to the various parts of this hub in order to complete various objectives, usually something like flipping a switch or something like that. And then you have to go back through the hub into another area in order to continue your objective. You'll find that puzzles often require you to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth through the same hub over and over and over again. And it's not necessarily obvious what you have to do, which can prove rather problematic. See, HeXen, while having much different levels, and certainly that's appreciated, than something like Heretic, also loses something in the process. Heretic was easy to understand. You went into it and you knew what you were doing. You may have to learn the level layout, but it was fairly straightforward and it made sense. HeXen, on the other hand, almost feels like it requires a guide. At certain points, you will just be baffled, and through no fault of your own. It's because the game is deliberately complex. Complex in that it designed these levels around the hubs and doing these puzzles in that hub area. So you find that that can actually prove incredibly frustrating. It's certainly different and well appreciated after playing something like Heretic that they would do something different and try something new, but it makes the game a lot more confusing and a lot more irritating to actually play, which is why I feel like it wasn't as successful as Heretic was. Heretic's one of those just wonderful classics of FPS gaming. HeXen feels like an interesting aside, an interesting experiment that is still good, it's still fun to play, but it's much more frustrating, and certainly not for people who are not capable of figuring out these kind of puzzles. If puzzle solving in an FPS is not your thing, do not play HeXen. You will not like it. And if maze-like levels where you're having to go back and forth constantly is not your thing, do not play HeXen. But that said, it still has plenty of really great moments. And even though the weapons often feel rather underpowered because enemies can just take a lot of damage, it's still pretty satisfying, particularly when you get access to those ultimate weapons, especially the Cleric's Staff. But it's worth noting that you're going to have trouble. There's going to be parts in the game where you just feel like the game is deliberately made to make you mad because it didn't give you quite enough mana and it sends you up against these huge hordes of enemies, or the level design is just incredibly confusing. But there is a fun time to be had here. Just don't go into it expecting the same thing as Heretic and Doom. Thanks for watching.